Okay, so we now come to our second topic, which is that of the differences in our Bibles that we can observe in our Bibles between the quotations of the Old Testament by New Testament authors and the actual Old Testament text that they seem to be referring to. So you mentioned earlier that there was a variety of texts circulating in this period. So how do we know that the Septuagint text was not contaminated by copyists? I mean, there must have been a great deal of pressure to make them match one of the current New Testament textual traditions. And to give but one example that I came across recently, in Deuteronomy 6, there are a couple of phrases that are quoted by Jesus in the account of the temptation in the desert. And some important Septuagint manuscripts, such as Codex Alexandrinus, actually have in their wording of Deuteronomy 6:13 something that's more in line with the Gospels than other Septuagint manuscripts. So instead of the Lord your God you will fear and him you will serve, which is what we have in the Hebrew and in the majority of Septuagint manuscripts, we have the Lord your God you will worship and him alone you will serve, which is exactly the way it is quoted in Matthew and Luke. So is this also part of the problem? I mean, how do we know that we are comparing the correct text when we study this issue?
Yes, and here we get into sort of the nitty-gritty of the understanding of how the New Testament writers were incorporating and using the Old Testament stuff. The textual issues certainly are complex. We have three different texts that we're having to discern. We have the Old Greek version, in this case of Deuteronomy, and all of its textual variants. We have the Hebrew text of Deuteronomy and its variations, as well as the New Testament text of Matthew that you were referring to. And we don't have the originals of any of these, and we have to, in some way, try to reconstruct what we understand the originals to be. So it's very complex in that regard. Fortunately, for the Old Greek of Deuteronomy, we now have the Göttingen edition, which is an eclectic text, but tries to reconstruct the text as it was produced by the translator. We have for the New Testament, of course, the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, and also now another major project for creating a new critical edition of the New Testament, well in hand. And in the case of the Hebrew text, we do have a project underway to create an eclectic edition of the Hebrew text out of the Hebrew University and so forth, but that's not yet complete. So we have made tremendous progress in that regard. And we can now stand on the shoulders of these scholars who have labored so intensively and have opportunity perhaps to see a little further into the textual forest than ever we could before. So let's assume then that, with the Göttingen edition of the Old Greek and with the Nestle-Aland text of Matthew and so forth, we've got, as best we can determine, the original text. So we come to Deuteronomy 6:13. And as you indicate, Codex Alexandrinus reading of proskunesis, you will worship, rather than ephabeithese, fear or reverence in some way, as a rendering for the Hebrew tense form tira, which means, again, you shall fear. We can also note that in Matthew 4 and verse 10, the text has proskunesis, you will worship, as you noted. So several questions emerge from this. First of all, how did the translator of Deuteronomy normally render tense forms of the verb yara, to fear, particularly when reference is being made to fearing Yahweh? Do we have any alternative Hebrew text for this verb, particularly in Deuteronomy 6:13? In other words, is the Hebrew text certain that a form of yara was indeed being read? Second question, what does the Old Greek textual evidence for Deuteronomy 6:13 indicate was the original text of Deuteronomy's translation? And again, considering the evidence, it seems quite certain that the Old Greek translator had tera in his Hebrew text and rendered it as phabeithese, you shall fear. The Greek translator of Deuteronomy did use the verb proskuneo, but tended to use it as a rendering for another Hebrew word, which tends to mean worship, or in some sense. And usually in that case, the object of the verb is foreign deities, and it becomes a prohibition. You shall not worship these gods. And this translator, in terms of pattern, tends to be fairly consistent in his use of default renderings. And it's also, I think, noteworthy that we have Codex Alexandrinus in Deuteronomy 10:20 making a similar substitution. So this seems to be something that the scribe of this manuscript, or the tradition behind the scribal tradition of Codex Alexandrinus, was perhaps sensitive to. In terms of the New Testament, NA 28 indicates that certainly proskunesis is what the author wrote, and whoever is responsible for the Gospel of Matthew's text. The writer acknowledges this material as a quotation because he introduces it with the formula gegraptai. It stands written that. Further, the other character in this dialogue, the ha diabolos, the devil, has urged Jesus in the preceding verse, ean passom proskunesis moi, if you falling down should do obeisance to me, worship me. So it may be that the writer has adjusted the quotation to fit this context more specifically. And the imagery then is of a subject doing obeisance to a sovereign. And perhaps this is the sense that Jesus reflects when he refuses to offer himself in subjection to Satan. Proskuneo can mean bow down, but with a variety of nuances. So the New Testament text then seems quite certain as well. Something has happened in the textual tradition of Alexandrinus that has led the scribe or a scribe at some point to substitute forms of proskuneo in Deuteronomy for forms of phabaomai, and thus bring it more into correspondence with the Matthew 4:10 version. When and by whom this was done is very uncertain. Codex Alexandrinus comes out of the 4th century AD, many years after the writing of Matthew's Gospel and certainly the translation of Deuteronomy. And we really don't know what led the textual tradition of Alexandrinus to this adjustment and so forth. So I think we have to be careful as we try to assess these things in terms of who's responsible for what and why. I don't think we should assume that the writer of Matthew's Gospel possessed a copy of the Old Greek that read proskunesis in Deuteronomy 6:13. It's certainly possible, but it's not necessary, and it may be that contextual factors have led the writer of Matthew to making this adjustment, at least in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. We sort of jumped in the deep end of the pool right away with this question, and indeed, the waters are deep in this area of study. And the next question also is not an easy one. Mm-hmm. But we're just going to continue right on with your from your last few sentences there. You mentioned that there are many factors that need to be taken into consideration when we look at differences in wording between the quotation and the Old Testament text. And you mentioned that it's not necessary to assume that the New Testament author had a Greek text of the Old Testament that reflects the differences we observe. So perhaps we could discuss another example. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 24-25, we have a quotation there, or what appears to be a quotation of Isaiah 40:6-8. This is a text that talks about the word of the Lord, or compared to the grass, that is compared to the grass that withers. So the 1 Peter text is not identical to either the Septuagint or the Hebrew Masoretic text. For example, both Old Testament texts conclude by a reference to our God, but the 1 Peter passage simply has Lord. So would you say this is an example where differences between the quotation and the Septuagint should be attributed to both, like the Septuagint translator and the New Testament author, interpreting or adapting the same Hebrew text in different ways? or are there just other factors involved when we look at this problem?
Yes, each text as we come to it that incorporates an Old Testament citation sort of has its own features that we have to carefully discern and understand before we sort of arrive at conclusions. In this case, first I would suggest that the writers or speakers in the New Testament document really control what text they might incorporate into their document or discourse, and then how they might adjust it to their context. As well, we know next to nothing about the situation in which they are writing or speaking, i.e., did the writer of 1 Peter have a copy of Septuagint Isaiah beside him when he inserted this quotation? Or did he have a copy of the Hebrew text of Isaiah, or could he even access such a copy, et cetera, right? All of these questions. Second, I think we have to be careful not to impose our standard of sort of textual citation that we use in our day to the use that writers or speakers made of such material 2,000 years ago. And this, again, I think requires us to exercise some discernment. And third, in my opinion, adjustments that assist the reader or the audience to understand the full meaning of the quotation, as the writer or speaker perhaps perceived it, and its relevance to the subject at hand, would probably be quite acceptable in that period. So bearing these factors in mind, we still have to make sense of the changes that you have mentioned and that we easily perceive when you sort of place the Greek translation of Isaiah 46-8 over against the Greek text that we have in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 24 and 25, and then look at each of those in comparison to the appropriate Hebrew text. So a couple of things. First of all, the text that the writer of 1 Peter cites does seem to be Septuagintal in origin. And I think the major piece of data for this is that both the Septuagint and 1 Peter text omit the last half of verse 7, and that suggests that the writer of 1 Peter is in fact accessing an old Greek version of this verse, of these verses. Secondly, the writer of 1 Peter does insert an additional comparative particle, hos, as, in the first part of his citation, so that all flesh is as something, right? And this is not, of course, in the Old Greek text, and this then raises the question, why is it there? I suggest that perhaps it's due to the New Testament writers' fondness for similes, which certainly is the case, and perhaps he decided to enhance the parallelism between the first and second clauses in order to have a comparative component in both clauses expressed in an explicit way. So there could be a rhetorical element at work in the way the New Testament writer has shaped the text. Thirdly, one of the other adjustments that we notice between the Old Greek and 1 Peter's text is that we read in the second line, all right, doxa otes, and its glory, rather than the doxa anthropou, the glory of humanity or human, as it is in the Septuagint, is quite different, right? And also, in the context of the Hebrew text, the reading is hasado, his, how shall I say, radiance, glory, however we want to understand chesed in this situation. And so the New Testament text reading its glory seems to be closer to the Hebrew text at this point, rather than to the Old Greek text, which has doxa and thropou. And this may reflect some knowledge of the Hebrew text. Alternatively, perhaps again, the writer is just trying to create greater parallelism between the first part of the quotation and the second part of the quotation. So we have all flesh is as grass and its glory, rather than adding, as it were, an additional component into the text as he has it. So it could again be rhetorical. We don't have any evidence, really, in my opinion, apart from this one variation that the writer of First Peter accessed the Hebrew text or knew the Hebrew text directly. And then we come to the alteration at the end, where the First Peter text has Kyriou, Lord, instead of tu theou hemon, our God, as we find in the Old Greek and also the Hebrew, Eloheinu. And this is a little more of a challenge, given the previous expression in verse 23 about the logos of theou, the word of God, and so forth. One might anticipate that the use of theou in the quotation would in some way fit better the rhetorical context and so forth. So what do we do with something like this? Well, first of all, when we look at the Septuagint, we find that whether theos renders the proper name of God, or Eloheinu, or Elohim rather, is of course quite variable. And similarly for Kyrios, it can render both forms of Elohim as well as the Tetragrammaton. So we have variation within the Old Greek tradition often in terms of how God is referenced in these ways. So we have to look at the Isaiah text to see whether or not there could have been variation within its textual tradition and that kind of thing. So we have to say, were there alternative renderings of the Old Greek tradition in this matter? I'm not aware of that per se, but it's something at least that has to be looked at carefully. Secondly, we have other examples in First Peter where the reference to Yahweh or Kyrios in the Old Testament is in some way connected with a reference to Kyrios or Jesus in the New Testament. And in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, we have apparently a reference to Isaiah 8 and verse 13. And we have the writer making this statement that one is to sanctify or set apart Kyrios as Christos, as Messiah, in your hearts. And we have a kind of identification between Kyrios and Christos in that text and so forth. So I wonder here again whether the writer of First Peter is making an exegetical decision, an interpretational decision, and wanting to emphasize that it is the word of Kyrios, God, Christ, that is important here, so that it's really the message of the gospel that he's talking about, as he indeed affirms in the latter part of verse 25. There's one other sort of minor point, and that is that when you move into chapter 2 of 1 Peter, verses 1 to 3, it is the word that gives growth to the Christian, and one tastes that the Kyrios, the Lord, is good. So these connections sort of flow through these texts in various ways. So here again, I think we're left with some questions. Number one, the text is cited seems to be the Old Greek. There are some variations, some of which can be explained, it seems to be, in terms of the rhetoric of the context of 1 Peter. And perhaps in one or two places, there might be suggestions about knowledge of Hebrew text. But I think it's really hard to prove that this has in fact influenced the reading or the citation as we have it in 1 Peter.
Good. Thanks, Larry. Thanks for guiding us through this one example. What are some resources that could be consulted to find out more about how New Testament authors employed Old Testament texts, whether Greek or Hebrew?
it's hard to find kind of a generic text. I think in most of these cases, we have to look at each New Testament book on its own, because there's been, in most cases, significant monographs written about how each of these documents, or in the case of the Pauline corpus, so Paul in all of his writings, at least those that are confidently attributed to him, has handled the Old Testament materials. In the case of First Peter, for example, we've got the monograph by William Shooter, Hermeneutic and Composition, or we have good commentaries such as Paul Achtemeyer's commentary on First Peter in the Hermeneia series. And I would think you just have to explore for each book these kinds of resources in order to get a sense about how each of these New Testament writers is handling this material.
Okay, thank you.